Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our June Broker Roundtable meeting with broker Robert Milligan. Today, we will be discussing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the changes which will go into effect on August 1st. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please type those into the questions box so we will be able to see them. Good morning, Robert. Would you like to start?
Good morning, Victoria. Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you for taking some time to get ahead of what's these changes that are to come here. And I'm going to go ahead and admit right now that I am not the de facto expert. I am kind of learning as I go as well, and nobody knows for sure how everything is going to play out and roll out. There's going to be a lot of kind of changes and things, but we have a few key points to discuss this morning that are some things that are going to directly affect your business. So, we're all just learning as we're going, and I believe, Victoria, you mentioned that we're going to have a more in-depth training on this as well in the near future in July, correct?
Yes, July 15th.
Okay, excellent. So this will be kind of a dumbed down version to prep you, and that's all that I'm capable of sometimes is the dumbed down version. So, so you just have to take the good with the bad here. But there's a few key points, I'd say maybe about 10 things that I have to discuss that you should know going forward about the new Truth in Lending Act, RESPA integrated disclosure. And the new closing statement form for all of our transactions is called the closing disclosure, and it's kind of like a merged form between the Truth in Lending Act, which used to be where all of the mortgage info was provided initially upon application, and the actual closing statement. So it kind of all gets kind of squished into one here, which will be interesting. I think it will actually be a positive change for consumers to have a better understanding of their transaction. So the new closing disclosure will be used for most loan applications, if not all. I guess the exception would be some private loans and things, but most all loan applications taken for new mortgages after August 1st this year. So August 1st is the big changeover date. Anything, a common question that I've been getting is if you sell something, a couple days prior to August 1st, are you going to have to change everything in midstream? And everybody I've talked to that's a perceived expert says no, that anything procured prior to August 1st is going to finish up just like a normal transaction, and anything procured, any new deals, new loans after August 1st will have these new standards applied. So the lender, not the closing agent, will be the one preparing and delivering the closing disclosure. So that is obviously a huge change, that the lender is going to have a lot more burdens and responsibilities in this process, and they will be the one preparing and delivering the closing disclosure to the consumer. So that's key number one. The second point that I'd like to make sure you're aware of is that the closing disclosure must be delivered to the buyer/consumer at least 3 business days prior to the scheduled closing date. So that is one time frame that's important to keep aware of, and there are more time frames as we go, because the problem that I guarantee is going to happen is some of these dates are going to pass by, and it's going to push the closing date past the stated date on the contract. Then we're going to have a lot of interesting legal issues, if this new law is causing people to go out of contract, whether or not their contract is void, whether or not they didn't perform, and their escrow deposit is susceptible to the seller. So it's going to be a little bit awkward at first, especially as everybody adapts to the system. So you want to be extremely proactive about making sure these time periods are hit. So the next key point is that the closing agent must get the information to the lender approximately 10 to 14 days prior to the closing date for completion of the closing disclosure to meet the delivery requirement. So you, as the realtor, you will need to communicate to the closing agent all your buyer paid charges 10 to 14 days prior to the closing date. So that is an ample cushion of time to make sure that this disclosure is prepared properly and delivered properly, because if the disclosure is not prepared properly and it needs amended, it's going to reset that 3-day period. So you need to have accurate information so that the closing disclosure can be prepared and you can start that 3 business day period so that the closing is not delayed. So you need to think in advance how you're going to be handling this communication, and just making sure that everything is set there. So that's a big one. That's going to be, I think, part of the primary responsibility that you're going to maybe have to be a little bit more fastidious about, to make sure that you get all of the buyer paid costs and everything submitted in advance, well in advance. The fourth key point, the closing agent will need your real estate company's license number and your individual real estate license number for the new closing disclosure. So that's a relatively easy thing to accomplish, but something that's different, something to be aware of. The fifth point here is that the closing disclosure sent to the buyer, it won't include the seller side of the transaction. So I'm still a little bit fuzzy how this is going to look. I don't know if the buyer will at any point see the seller side, or if at no point the seller's information will be submitted to the buyer, which will be kind of interesting. You know, the buyer really does not need to be privy to how much the seller's proceeds or payoff or anything like that is. So I'm still wondering, and somebody may know. We may get better information about that in the future. But the closing disclosure will not include seller's info anymore. It's only going to be pertaining to the buyer. The closing agent, not the lender, is responsible for completing and delivering the seller side of the closing disclosure. So, you know, now the mortgage company is taking more responsibility for the buyer side, but the closing agent, the title company or attorney, is the one responsible for delivering this information to the seller. The closing agent may decide to prepare a separate closing disclosure for the seller, and so I guess that kind of maybe I just answered my own question. So the seller's info may or may not be disclosed to the buyer in the future. My assumption would be the new standard practice will be that it will not be disclosed. So it'd be interesting to see how that goes. Sixth point to take a note of, you will likely not receive an advanced copy of the closing disclosure before it's delivered to the buyer or consumer. So that's interesting as well, because from our vantage point, you know, sometimes we're the first line of defense of protection to our client, to our customer, and we're not going to see what they're seeing before they see it. So it will be interesting to see, you know, it should be a pretty clear and easy to understand form. But, you know, until we actually see one and see what happens, we might see that it's causing our customers some consternation, and we will not really have a way to prep them for what they're about to see, and we will be seeing it as they see it. So another thing to be aware of that's interesting, the lender will likely send the closing disclosure to the closing agent when it's sent to the buyer. And also the settlement agent will not be permitted to send a copy to real estate agents. You will need to obtain a copy from the borrower. So that is also an interesting change in all of this, that the settlement agent will not be permitted to send a copy to real estate agents. You have to get that from your buyer. So very, very interesting. Point number 7 is that the changes to the closing disclosure after delivery to the buyer may trigger a new 3-day period if changes cause the annual percentage rate to be inaccurate. The buyer changes loan product or prepayment penalty is added. So that's kind of what I discussed earlier on, that if there's a significant change of any sort, it's going to start the 3 business day period over again and again, causing delays in the closing, which could potentially cause your contract to go out of contract. And you know, it will be interesting to see legally what the ramifications to your customer, if your customer is the buyer, will be. If you know this, you know, their closing being delayed is something that will be a breach of contract on the buyer's end. You know, just these are things that are going to be important, and just a lot of stuff I think that's going to be interesting how it plays out. Changes and adjustments affecting the value of the property as determined by the lender may trigger additional disclosure and review periods under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, controlling the delivery of appraisals. And you may want to consider 2 pre-settlement inspections or walkthroughs. First inspection 7 days in advance of the closing, and a second inspection on the day of closing. So I don't know why exactly they're suggesting this. I've got just, you know, a few key points that I'm reading from a list here, but you know, I think that's probably a good practice anyway, if possible. The 8th point is that review and become familiar with the closing disclosure so that you can answer buyer and seller questions. Note the closing disclosure refers to the owner's title insurance as optional in some circumstances. Obtain appropriate advice for the buyer on the protections given to them through owner's title insurance. That's obvious, and I think most of us already do that anyway. Even if somebody's paying cash, I highly recommend that you get title insurance in every issue, especially when dealing in REO properties or distressed properties. The 9th point is that the new TRID rules, TRID rules, may affect the contract terms that you help negotiate for either buyer or seller. So for example, a closing 30 days out may no longer be realistic, and that's a key point to watch. if your contract form contains a set number of days for the closing to occur, then a minimum of 15 additional days may be advisable. And if your contract form requires you to fill in a specific date, take additional time into consideration. It's important for you to communicate with the lender and closing agent to determine a realistic time frame for closings under these new rules. So, just generally speaking, it just seems to me that all of us are going to have to communicate and work more closely with our title company and with our mortgage company and as the realtor. So there's going to be a much higher level of communication and integrating all of our services together and making sure that we're all on the same page. So the 10th point is give some forethought to what system you have in place to communicate changes to the contract after it's been signed to the lender. Consider having a conversation with buyers about their needs to respond immediately to lender requests and remind the seller they must follow the contract to the letter, because not doing so may delay the closing. So, again, communication is going to be key here. Our job, I know a lot of realtors in the past have outsourced a lot of the communicative tasks to the lender, to the closing company, and a lot of realtors have had the perspective that they could kind of take a back seat and let everybody else do the work as they delegate some of these tasks. I think it's the big takeaway from the way that the transaction is going to flow in the future is just going to be that everybody is going to have to work very, very closely together to make sure that these hurdles are all crossed, and that does include your customer. Your customer is going to have to, really step up to the plate and make sure that they're providing the information that's needed from them to make sure that all of these disclosures and everything get created and delivered effectively and timely. So those are the main principles that we are going to have to be aware of as realtors. I've seen a lot of other information about some of the different steps that the title companies are going to have to take and some of the steps that the mortgage brokers are going to have to take. So lenders are going to have a lot more responsibility in the future, and for our perspective as realtors, we will have some more responsibility. We will have to communicate more timely, but all in all, I think that lenders and title companies are taking the brunt of the additional work and tasks, but we just have to make sure that we're more involved in the transaction process. So I hope that that gives you a glimpse, a sneak peek in what's to come, and as I said, I'm not purporting myself to be the de facto expert yet. I've actually enrolled in a class that I have yet to take that starts next week. So, just sharpening the saw and getting ready for what's to come. And we also have a webinar from a lender's perspective coming up in July, I believe on the 15th. So, now would be the time if you have any questions. I might not know the answer quite yet, but this would be a good time if you'd like to type some questions in and get some specific help, some specific things answered. We can do our best to facilitate that. And aside from that, I don't have anything further to share at this time. Does anybody have anything they'd like some specific help with?
I don't see anything yet. That was some great information. Thank you, Robert, for sharing that with us.
Well, good. I didn't sleep all weekend making sure it was good for everybody.
No, it doesn't look as though we have any questions. If you do have any questions after the webinar is over, please feel free to email Robert. Robert, what's the best email to reach you on?
Simply robert@robertmilligan.com.
Okay, perfect. All right, thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.